Chapter 5. 6 hours later, Zeke had yet to add a single new item to the boards. Still, his so-called bucket list for the end of the world had remained empty other than to spoil his dogs. Every single thing he thought of just sounded trivial. First, he had thought of going somewhere awesome, but to do what? Just see it? That wouldn't do anything. It accomplished nothing. What was the point of going to see Yellowstone or Banff or anywhere else for that matter? He wouldn't be around to remember it, and no one else would be around to remember he went. Then, Zeke's mind went to maybe trying a new hobby. Maybe, he thought, it was finally time to learn to play the guitar. He'd always wanted to, but he had never had the wherewithal to see it through. But, again, he found himself asking, what was the point of learning the guitar? It took years to become proficient in an instrument, and he had just 6 months. He saw little point in spending his last months learning how to play Mary Had a Little Lamb. The only thing he could think of was to try to help someone somehow. He knew that was something he would definitely look into doing, so as his 7th hour of brainstorming came to a close, he decided to add it to the list. Number 1, blank. Number 2, blank. Number 3, spoil the dogs. Number 4, help someone. Helping people, he figured, would be something rather limited. He could go into Phoenix or Tucson and volunteer some of his time, especially over Christmas, but that would be it. After the news broke, he didn't want to be anywhere near a city, at least not for several months. Turning his mind away, there was nothing else that came up. He couldn't think of anything. A change of scenery was needed, he told himself, so he called for his dogs. Running into the room at full speed, the dogs knew that Zeke calling them at that time of day meant only one thing was in their future. They knew instantly they were going to the lake. The water at the lake was as placid as always, the few ripples spreading across it coming from the ducks that called it home year-round. The air was cold, the sky was clear, and the mountains in the distance were vivid in their golden hour pink of early evening. The dogs were at full force the moment Zeke opened his door, Herman doing his best to stay out of Cagney's way as Cagney became a wrecking ball. So many sights and smells that weren't going to see and smell themselves. Putting Herman on the ground and closing his car, Zeke took a deep breath. With the exhalation just started, Cagney reached the end of the leash. He yanked it, sending both him and Zeke off balance. "Oh, come on, Cags. How do you not know better by now?" The dog had no apologies about him as he looked expectantly back at Zeke. The pup's tongue was out and to the side, and his tail was upright. "Are you coming, Dad? Come on!" Zeke made them wait a moment before releasing, and they headed toward the trail. As his 2 dogs dragged him by one of the lake's largest saguaros, he stared up at it. The lake had a number of large saguaro cacti around it, and though Zeke had appreciated the plant since he'd moved to Arizona, he'd never really stopped to fully take one in. He had stopped and snapped photos of them on numerous occasions, but because it was part of a pretty scene, it was the scene. It wasn't the cactus. He took in as much as he could. Tinted in the fading pink of sunset, it was over 2 stories tall, pockmarked with holes signifying the past and present nests of desert birds. In places, the holes almost made it look like the cactus was rotting. Looking up its side, he could see hundreds of its sharpened needles, each one at least an inch in length, making their way up in remarkably straight lines. He felt slightly embarrassed with himself that he'd never taken the time to look. It was a beautiful plant, and as the dogs pulled him away, he realized he was glad he saw it, that he actually saw it. Zeke looked around as Cagney stopped to sniff a bush. It truly was a remarkable little oasis nestled deep in the Arizona desert. The breeze picked up, the cold of its sting feeling like a refreshing cold shower. Zeke closed his eyes, his head instinctively looking up. He let himself feel the moment, unimpeded by the occasional dilution that could be caused by sight. The cold breeze cut through his skin just as many breezes before, but once through, it seemed to bathe another side of him in its frost. His bones were left untouched, still just as warm as ever under his meaty skin and fleece hoodie. The breeze had cut through him and extinguished the searing flame in his heart, brought about by the despair of dying without a purpose. Opening his eyes, Zeke looked down, his dog sitting patiently and staring up at him, their whining to continue the walk only then registering. "Sorry, boys, let's go." Zeke didn't need to say it a second time. The evening was quiet, so the crunch of the sandy gravel under his feet seemed to carry across the entire lake. It formed a rhythm that Zeke didn't realize at first, but he and his dogs had begun to walk almost on beat. Trying to keep the beat, which was harder now that he had realized he was doing it, he looked up, the first stars now poking their way through the darkening colors above. It was Herman's turn to stop the crew. Zeke kept his eyes up as the dogs sniffed, watching the stars gradually become more and more numerous, showcasing their beauty one at a time, from most luminous to least. Staring up at the light Zeke knew was Venus, the fire in his heart reignited, and he suddenly found it more laborious to breathe. One day soon, he'd look up and see a new light dotting the sky. He'd look up and it wouldn't just be a distant planet whose presence in the sky was more comforting than its absence. It would be a planet 4 times the diameter of Earth, whose presence could only mean doom. He didn't have a moment to let the sudden rush of anxiety get to him. A desert hare had hopped onto the path ahead of them, and Cagney and Herman both saw it. Zeke, having not been paying much attention, nearly fell flat on his face as the pair sprinted away. He pulled back on the dog's leashes, gaining some control over them. "Boys," he said loudly, deepening his voice. He thought that made him sound more alpha, and they generally listened pretty well when he did that. He would never yell or scream at them, but a slightly raised voice with a lower tone seemed to typically work well when they really lost control. The dogs read the tone and slowed. They couldn't bring themselves to fully stop, but it was enough for him to gain the upper hand. They returned to their walk as scheduled, the dogs now turning their focus toward the basic sniffing and occasional marking. Zeke fixated on what he was seeing and hearing as they walked around that lake. The soft sound of wings lightly tapping the water called out calmly as a duck took off and skimmed the surface, and the ripples formed from the wings' contact on the water extended out and distorted the reflection. A distant coyote howl sang out to the growing patterns of stars. The tiny black figures of bats, almost invisible in the mounting darkness, flew about in sporadic patterns. Zeke absorbed that location like never before. Making their way back to the parking lot, Zeke turned and took the scene in again as the pups sniffed the concrete. Feeling like he successfully mentally photographed the scene, Zeke dropped their waste bag in a bin, loaded the pups in his car, and they headed back home. His dry erase boards were waiting for him, their near-blank faces taunting him. Zeke eyed them as he went to his fridge and pulled out a beer, Cagney and Herman lapping at their water bowls. Sipping the bitter ale, leaning against the kitchen counter, his mind remained blank of ideas. It's the end of the world and I can't think of anything else to do? In his peripheral, the calendar, which had often hung forgotten on the wall, caught his eye. Still open to September from the previous year, the image struck him. It was a saguaro. The thought came like a spark. He was glad he had taken time to actually look at that cactus by the water. He was glad he had stood under its shadow and felt what it was like to be next to something so amazing. He was glad he had seen and felt that place, and that was all that really mattered. Nothing else had mattered but the moment, and really, that's what mattered. In a blink, he knew what he was going to do. If nothing was going to matter in a few months, he'd rather have those ineffectual moments occur in someplace breathtaking rather than in his kitchen. He loved his town, and the town lake was still one of his favorite places in the world, but he wasn't going to spend the rest of his time there. He was absolutely not going to die in the desert. Having spent most of his life in Florida and within just a few miles of the Gulf of Mexico, He couldn't think of a place he'd less like to be at when it happened. The desert was great, but it was not in his blood. That would always be salt water. His dogs had never seen the ocean. They had never experienced what it felt like to walk along the beach. He knew people who didn't own dogs would never understand, but he desperately wanted to give them that experience. They depended on him as a child would a parent, and though Zeke knew the two were vastly different, he still looked at the dogs as if they were his children, especially since children had not been in the cards for him. The dogs had no idea what was coming, and Zeke was thankful for that. And before they were forced to live through the terror of the end, a terror made all the worse by sensing what's happening, but not truly understanding it, he wanted them to experience every single thing a dog could. Spoiling them was not limited to food and toys. Zeke was going to make sure it included experiences the dogs would also appreciate. They only had one go on that ball of dirt just like him, and though not sentient in the same ways as a human, there was something incredibly intelligent behind those eyes. That something, whatever that something was, deserved as much joy as he did, and he was going to make sure that happened. Zeke was going to get the hell out of Dodge. He was going to take the dogs, a few personal items, and head out. He was going to travel the country. He was going to see and feel the country before it was no longer there, before he was no longer there. As he'd become more socially removed in his 30s, Zeke had missed out on a lot of what life offered in order to keep his entirely safe and predictable existence. For the most part, he'd been okay with it. It wasn't as if he hadn't found time to still go to and see places, meet people, and do crazy activities. Plus, his 20s had a lifetime of craziness in just one decade. Now, though, there was no more time to be found. He had what he had, and that was all there was to it. He would never see 40. There wasn't a way to take out a loan or get additional credit. There was no going into a bank and saying, yeah, I'd like to take out a loan of 2 years. He would plan and then leave immediately following the announcement, wasting no time. That meant the next month would be filled with more planning than he'd initially expected, but the drive to see it through that was building within him was already greater than any he'd experienced in recent years. He was going to do it, no matter what it took. He just had to figure out what needed to get done and then do it. First, he had to break their routines. It had been a comfortable way to live, and when someone is able to live a life of comfort and routine, as he and the dogs had, it isn't an entirely terrible way to spend their time. However, with time now being an incredibly finite resource, a life purely of comfort and routine was not how he wanted to see things out. To actually implement this plan, he'd have to sell his house. He was going to need to get a travel trailer, and he just didn't have the money for it otherwise. Selling the home, though, would most likely take longer than he wanted to give it. He didn't want to have to pay the mortgage off either, so it'd have to be some sort of under-the-table transfer of items. He seriously doubted he was going to find someone willing to go through that, but he decided to give it a shot. He would set time aside, too, to do some volunteering in Tucson on Christmas Eve and in Phoenix on Christmas. After Christmas, he would get one more refill of Herman's meds, and by then, hopefully, he'd have found a way to trade his home for a travel trailer or RV. He, Cagney, and Herman were going to see the beauty of Earth while it existed. Even when beauty is finite, Zeke had decided, and even when that recognition is also finite, that beauty still deserves that recognition. That beauty deserved to be seen, and it deserved to be felt while it could. And he would. He didn't really know where he was going to go. That he could figure out over the next month. But he would go. Along the way, he didn't know, and he didn't care. In the end, the real destination was the same. In a way, knowing so definitely that the end really was near and knowing how that would most likely come made the idea of the unknowns of the open road exponentially more exciting than they already were. Zeke had always found power in the open road. There really was something about it. The evident and strict path you follow gives you the assurance of a destination, but the unknowns and dangers that come between those lines create a sense of being alive that the modern concrete jungle had taken away. 2. As human as the idea of long road trips seemed, there was something nearly spiritual about them that hearkened to an animalistic need deep inside him. A need, a call to migrate. Thinking about it as he took his beer with him to the sofa, Zeke flipped on the TV. The soccer game was on, and he was going to enjoy it.